Hi there. All right, today we're still on Marcus Garvey. We're going to talk about um, part two is going to be talking about his activism. And you know what activism is? It's someone who is trying to make life better for others through going out and either protesting or doing something, being active, basically, to make things better for others. And you'll understand it more when I talk about exactly how he was an activist. The first thing we're going to talk about is what a union is. So when you work a job, a union is a group of people who work a job. It can be either a bunch of people who work for a singular place, like say everybody who works for all the Walmarts got together. It could be like that, or it could be something like people who all work in different restaurants in the restaurant industry get together. So it's groups like that, either a specific business um, or a specific field the people are in. They get together and they basically, you pay dues and you become a member of an organization that's called a union, and they work to make life better for the people who work in that business or in those organizations. They work on things like getting better wages, better benefits, better working conditions, things like that. They have an infrastructure. There's a leader of the union. They have officers, and they, as a united group, come together and petition for, like, it's better than just me going to my boss and saying, "Hey, I want a raise." The group would get together and say, "Hey, people in this position deserve to be paid better." And that's where you get things like strikes, the unions, and I'll talk about that later on. Marcus Garvey was involved in this strike. They got him in some trouble. But the union will get together and say, "Hey, if you don't pay these people what they deserve to be paid, then they're not going to come to work." And everybody who's a part of that union won't work. And you can obviously see how that could be damaging to the company. So then the people are better able to get in a position where they actually get the raise or get the benefits. Anyway, I didn't want to go into a rant about unions. We'll probably talk about unions more at a later time, because I have a very strong opinion, like I do about everything, I guess. I have very strong opinions about unions. I'd like to talk to you all about them and see what you think. Anyway, so Marcus Garvey, obviously, he joined the Printers Union in Jamaica, because that's what the business he was in. And he actually became the vice president of this union, one of the vice presidents of this union. And in 1908, he helped organize a print workers' strike. I'm not sure how successful this strike was. It lasted for a little while. And then when they say the strike broke, basically it means people went back to work. So once the strike ended, his bosses branded him a troublemaker and he lost his job. He got fired. Now, in a lot of instances, especially in America, we're talking about 1908. In America now, it's hard to fire someone because of a strike. There are rules and laws in place to protect people, but obviously that was not the case in 1908 Jamaica. So Marcus Garvey lost his job. He was branded a troublemaker. He had a very hard time finding work. He was working full time as a printer with his printer, and he ended up only being able to find part-time work with the government, printing work with the government part-time. So it really damaged him and his reputation. He became angry about Jamaican inequality as a result of this. The whole reason he was petitioning was to help people, either wages or working conditions or something like that. And he started to look around and realize that the people were treated unfairly. Now let's remember, he grew up in a middle-class family, so he wasn't poor. But he did see a lot of poor people, poor blacks in particular. And even though he wasn't poor, he was middle class, he was treated poorly because he was black. And again, we have to remember Jamaica wasn't its own country at the time. It was a colony of Britain. So whites were coming in and treating the blacks in Jamaica like second-class citizens or like lower-class citizens. And he was getting tired of it. And this is where his activism kicked in, starting with that strike. So then he joined what was called the National Club in Jamaica. So the National Club was a nationalist organization. Nationalist organizations are basically organizations that want an entity to become their own nation, free from the people who they are under. In this case, obviously, Jamaica was under British rule. So this nationalist organization was wanting Jamaica to become its own country, which it eventually did in the 60s, long after Marcus Garvey died. But he was one of the people who tried to help Jamaica get to that point earlier. Again, obviously he was I'm sorry. So during this time when he was with his nationalist organization, among other things, they called for the removal of the governor of Jamaica. Now, the governor of Jamaica was the person who ruled Jamaica in Britain's stead. In other words, the leader of Jamaica technically was the British crown, or the king, the queen, at that time, the king of Britain was the ruler of Jamaica officially. But obviously, he couldn't be everywhere. He ruled a lot of places all over the globe. It used to be said the sun never sets on the British Empire. Because they had so much land around the globe. They literally were in control at one point of 25% of the land on Earth, which is insane, because if you go look at a map, Britain is tiny. But they had enormous influence all over the world. And they did not treat their subjects well in the places outside of Britain. Usually subjects with brown skin. And I'm just telling you the truth. So they wanted to remove the governor of Jamaica, ostensibly because they felt like that governor was just doing the work for Britain and they didn't really care about the people. And they also wanted to stop India indentured servants from being sent to Jamaica. Now let's talk about that. First of all, India was also a British colony. Indentured servitude. So what happens is a person travels somewhere, and in exchange for traveling to that place, they are required to work basically for free. They're working off their travel expenses or whatever for a certain amount of time, usually some years. They were treated pretty much like slaves. And as a matter of fact, that's a lot of the way slavery got started. I'll let you come over here. I'll bring you over here to this new land, but you got to work for me for free for 3, 5, 7 years, however long it is. And then it's a really nasty situation, because then people would build up more expenses, and then they end up basically being indentured servants for life, which basically means they were slaves. It's just not called that. A lot of people could end up working themselves free. Many didn't. So this was a very nasty way to get free labor that the British were using by bringing people from India over with promises of a better life. And what it was also doing was making it hard for people who were in Jamaica, blacks in Jamaica, couldn't find jobs because the indentured servants were doing the jobs for free. Jamaicans wanted to be paid, obviously. So that was an economic hardship for black people in Jamaica. So Indians were being treated poorly, and Jamaicans were being treated poorly to the benefit of the British. And they were trying to stop this with this nationalist club. Of course, he published a pamphlet called The Struggling Mass. Again, he's using his talents. He's a printer. So he created a pamphlet called The Struggling Mass, which talked about this nationalist organization and the things that they were doing. Eventually, he traveled to Costa Rica for employment, because obviously working part-time in Jamaica, he wasn't making a lot of money. He wasn't getting paid working for the nationalist organization. That was volunteer work. So he had to go somewhere where he could actually make some money. And he found someone helped him find a job in Costa Rica, where he was a supervisor. Obviously, this man is a great leader, because he ends up being a supervisor wherever he goes. So even though he was a supervisor, he hated the way this company treated the employees that were under him. So he started a newspaper criticizing the employer and the industry that the employer worked in. Eventually, he ended up living in London. He lived in a lot of other places in the Caribbean as well. He traveled a lot. He ended up living in London, where he worked for a magazine. Again, his printing background. The magazine was called the African Times and Orient Review, and they advocated for freedom for Egypt. Egypt was also a British colony. Like I said, 25% of the globe was under Britain at one time. So he worked for a magazine and actually was getting paid working for this magazine, advocating for freedom for Egypt. And he started out as a messenger. He ended up writing for this particular magazine because of his writing skills. So again, his activism is clear. He doesn't like seeing people being oppressed, and he worked very hard to help people to not be oppressed. which is a good way to live your life, obviously. It caused him some hardships, but sometimes you've got to go through things like that to help a cause that you truly believe in. And it was said later on, and we're going to get into an organization he started in Jamaica that he brought to America. It's going to really kick off his career when I talk to you all tomorrow about this. But he talked to a man who gave him more information about colonial Africa, than he had previously. Now, again, he was going to places where Britain had colonies, but he was made aware that Africa was colonized by more than Britain. You had Italy, Portugal, Dutch at one point, Spain. You had a lot of colonies, a lot of different European countries colonizing Africa. And he heard a lot about these hardships. And it caused him to kind of form his worldview. He envisioned a movement that would politically unify Black people of African descent across the world. Now, I briefly touched on Pan-Africanism before when I talked about him in the intro, but that's basically what Pan-Africanism is. A movement that will politically unify Black people of African descent across the world, because he saw the plight of Africa being colonized by Europeans, Jamaicans suffering under European rule, Egyptians, they're in Africa, obviously, but all these other countries in Haiti and the Caribbean where he traveled, Costa Rica, all these places. And Costa Rica was run by the Spanish, by the way. But all these places were being controlled by European rule, where it were majority Blacks. So in his mind, if Blacks could unite, then that would be to their benefit. Similar to the Union. Again, that's kind of probably where he got that idea from, people uniting to work for a cause greater than themselves. But we're going to talk a lot more about him and his Pan-Africanism. But you see him being an activist at a very, very early age. He's in his 20s doing these things. And he really, really, really believed in Blacks having self-determination, which means Blacks can determine how their lives go without European influence necessarily. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Love you guys. Talk to you soon.